I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. How did people handle their emotional distress during COVID? Face-to-face therapy wasn't practical, but online therapy was. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
In addition to putting sessions on Zoom, a number of apps have gotten traction during this time to help people who are stuck at home.
People with depression or anxiety might find teletherapy useful. Will insurance cover the sessions?
Find out what online therapy is like and when it might be appropriate for adults and adolescents. Can it break down some of the stigma people still feel about admitting they're having mental health problems?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, explore the pros and cons of online therapy.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the coronavirus trends show that the vaccines are working. In most places with high vaccination rates, infections are continuing to drop at impressive speed. In New York City, for example, there were no COVID deaths over Memorial Day, and the rate of positive tests was below 1%. Maine also reported no new deaths over the holiday weekend. Iowa is also reporting no additional deaths and the lowest level of hospitalizations in more than a year. Illinois is also seeing progress. 2/3 of the adults in the state have gotten at least one shot. Florida and Oregon are also reporting improvement. On Wednesday, the New York Times reported that cases had dropped 45% over the last 2 weeks, and deaths were down 44%.
Vaccination is not the only way to achieve immunity from SARS-CoV-2. Italy still lags in vaccination, but a new study shows that people who have recovered from COVID-19 are largely protected from reinfection for at least a year. The researchers collected data from the region of Lombardy, which was hit especially hard early in the pandemic. They conclude that, quote, natural immunity to SARS-CoV-2 appears to confer a protective effect for at least a year, which is similar to the protection reported in vaccine studies.
Recovery from COVID can be a significant challenge, however. We don't yet know how many of those who had COVID and are no longer acutely ill suffer with lingering symptoms that affect their quality of life. Likewise, there are no statistics on how many people were left with giant medical bills that will wear them down over the coming years. COVID tests and vaccinations are free, but treatment may not be. At the height of the pandemic, many healthcare systems picked up the tab for treating desperately ill COVID patients and accepted what the insurance companies paid. They recognized that in a national emergency, public health and survival should be prioritized over profit. Now, however, survivors are increasingly having to deal with extremely high medical bills. Only those on Medicaid and those with no insurance coverage are protected by law from such bills. Treatment for long-lasting complications of COVID, such as severe fatigue, dizziness on standing, brain fog, tinnitus, and hearing loss, may not be covered.
Parkinson's disease is the world's fastest-growing brain disease. There's evidence that chemicals in our environment, such as TCE, chlorpyrifos, and the herbicide paraquat, are associated with higher risks for this neurodegenerative disease. Now, a study links air pollution to a significant risk of PD. A cohort study of nearly 79,000 people found a significant link to exposure to a marker for air pollution, nitrogen dioxide. Perhaps it's time for physicians and policymakers to reconsider the ancient Greek concept that bad air could contribute to health problems.
Expanding wastes, also known as central obesity, are often linked to high blood pressure, elevated blood sugar, and unhealthy lipid levels in a cluster referred to as metabolic syndrome. This is associated with an increased risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular complications. A new study published in the Annals of Internal Medicine compared aerobic exercise training with Tai Chi classes and with no formal exercise. Each group consisted of 181 participants more than 50 years old. The interventions lasted 3 months. During that time, the control group lost less than a centimeter in waist circumference, but both of the active groups lost considerably more fat from their middles. In addition, they improved their levels of high-density cholesterol. The Tai Chi group held on to that improvement for at least 9 months. The investigators conclude that Tai Chi is as effective as standard exercise for controlling waist circumference. It may be preferable for some older people, as the slower pace of movement may be easier for them to sustain. It's especially popular in Asian countries. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The country is gradually starting to open back up, but last year was one of high anxiety and incredible stress. Essential workers put their lives on the line every time they showed up on the job. Others, under stay-at-home orders, couldn't visit with elderly relatives to make sure they were all right, and many times they were not.
Many people needed the kind of help they could get from therapy, but they couldn't see a therapist face-to-face. Is online therapy a viable option in situations like these? Are there advantages to Zoom therapy?
What about privacy? If the kids are at home, how can you find a quiet space to talk with a therapist?
To learn more about these topics, we turn to Amy Morin, a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. She is editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind and hosts the Very Well Mind podcast. Amy has written several books, including her most recent, 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Amy Morin.
Thanks for having me.
Amy, things have changed a lot in the world of psychotherapy and mental health. I suspect a lot of people have had some real struggles over the last year because of the pandemic, and a lot of mental health workers are feeling overwhelmed. They just don't have enough hours in the day to deal with everybody's problems. I'm just wondering, how has your practice been affected?
So these days, I really don't see people in private therapy anymore. I'm mostly a writer and a speaker. So I tend to do things on a bigger level these days rather than see people one-on-one in my office.
Have you heard from any of your colleagues about changes in their practice that the pandemic and the various stressors that it has brought with it have affected?
Definitely. So my sister's a therapist. One of my neighbors is a therapist. I still keep in touch with a lot of people who are doing therapy. And it was a huge change for them to start doing therapy online as opposed to being able to do face-to-face treatment. And so, for example, my sister lives in rural Maine, where a lot of people don't have fast internet. And they had to do treatment over Zoom. And it was a huge barrier. She spent a lot of time trying to help people deal with technological issues. And even her own internet isn't the fastest. So things would cut in and cut out. And other therapists are telling me that because everybody's home during the day, that their patients don't have a private place to talk. So sometimes their clients are having to go in the bathroom and shut the door and do a therapy appointment from their bathroom, which isn't ideal. But at the same time, it might be the only place where somebody feels comfortable opening up and talking because their kids are home, their partners are home. And sometimes people have to whisper. They feel like they can't really talk to someone. But I'm also hearing some good things. Some people are saying that their clients are feeling more comfortable talking over Zoom, or they feel as though when they do a video appointment, it's a little bit less intense than being in the therapy office. So some people say they really like it. They've enjoyed not having to commute to the therapist's office, and they feel more comfortable opening up when they aren't sitting face to face.
And I imagine that the fact that they don't have to commute also makes some people readier to engage in a therapy session if it doesn't involve a lot of time, extra time out of their day.
Yeah, fortunately, people are finding that they don't have to struggle for a parking space. They don't have to worry about the amount of time it's going to take to get there. There's a little more freedom and flexibility. Some therapists are offering a wider range of appointment times because they're at home as well. So they might be able to offer evening appointments or weekend appointments, whereas in a traditional office setting, that might not have been available.
You know, Amy, I suspect a lot of people, when they imagine therapy, they imagine the old days where the therapist is looking in the eye of the individual who is seeking assistance, and there's body language and there's eye contact, and there's sort of that unspoken stuff that happens when two people are just across from each other. And that seems a lot harder when it's either by video or, if people don't have a good internet connection, by telephone, by cell phone. What are the pros and cons of being in an office space together and then being, at home and trying to establish the same kind of communication skills?
There is a lot to be said for body language. When you're in an office setting and somebody maybe says that they're struggling to express how they're feeling, but yet they're wringing their hands, you might notice that they're anxious, even if they can't verbalize that that's how they're feeling. Or somebody who maybe is moving really slowly, that could be a sign that they're depressed. It's tougher to pick those things up when you're talking on the phone or when you have a Zoom call. And for people that do more traditional online therapy, where maybe they aren't doing this just because of COVID, because a lot of therapists who were seeing people in an office just simply switched to seeing people over Zoom, and they're still seeing the same patients. They know them well. They've already met them. And so it might not be quite as difficult as opposed to some of these online therapy services where they've never met people and maybe they never actually see them. They're just communicating via text or chat or email, and they really don't get a good sense of how people talk or how they move, what their posture is, how they look when they're talking, what their body language is. So that can certainly be a barrier. But as we mentioned before, for some people, it's just easier to be anonymous. So when you use those traditional online therapy services, usually you don't have to give your real name. You could just call yourself Bob, or you could say any kind of nickname that you want. And then maybe it's easier to open up about things you've never opened up before. And for a lot of people, it's scary to see somebody's face. Maybe you went through something traumatic and you're afraid if you say that to a therapist, and then you see the reaction on their face when you say it. And that's really scary. That prevents a lot of people from opening up. They say, I don't want my therapist to look at me in a disgusted way, or I don't want to horrify my therapist by admitting something that happened. When you do that online and you don't necessarily have to see the person's reaction, sometimes that's easier. And for people who maybe aren't all that verbal, they don't enjoy communicating in a traditional setting, sometimes writing it out, just writing it putting something down on paper can help you make more sense of the chaos in your head. And then you can edit it too. So you can go back and say, this is what I'm thinking, and here's how I felt, and this is what I did. And maybe you feel like you can communicate in a more organized manner. Of course, on the flip side of that, some people feel like I'm not a good writer and it's hard for me to put it in words, or I overthink it so much that if I were to try to send an email to a therapist, it would take me all day and then I probably wouldn't send it in the end. So those people might be better to have a phone conversation or a video chat with someone. So it's really about, I guess, knowing yourself and knowing how you communicate best and figuring out how do you find a therapist that works well with the parameters that you have. And in a lot of cases, online therapy can be quite effective.
Amy, it sounds as though there's quite a range of potential services, and I'm not actually familiar with them. So perhaps you could describe what you're talking about so that I and my listeners, our listeners, can understand it.
As a writer for Verywell Mind, a year and a half ago, it was before the pandemic, I got to test all the major online therapy websites personally. And as a therapist who had only seen people in an office setting, I was a little bit skeptical at first about what it would be like to go to online therapy, and I had a lot of questions about it. To my surprise, it was a lot better than I expected it to be. And I thought this could be really helpful for a lot of people. So some of the major players out there are places like Talkspace or BetterHelp, and they offer lots of different ways to communicate with a therapist. BetterHelp, you can just chat on the phone if you want. You can schedule video appointments if you want to do that, but you can also sort of message a therapist throughout the day. And it's not via your regular text message number. You usually have like a private therapy room where you can leave messages for your therapist, almost like an email, but kind of like text message, somewhere in between. And your therapist will reply. And if we take Talkspace, for example, you'll find out when your therapist is going to reply. It will say, expect an answer within 8 hours or by tomorrow at noon, which can be really helpful. So then you know when to expect an answer, and your therapist writes back to you. So you could write about maybe you had something going on yesterday, or you're stressed out in general, or you're experiencing depression and you want to know what kind of strategies help. You can ask questions. You can say, is this normal? Here's what I'm experiencing. And a therapist will write back to you. So it's, again, different than having an appointment, and you don't have to wait until, say, next Thursday and to just have one appointment a week. You can talk to your therapist usually 5 days a week and get a reply 5 days a week, sometimes twice in the same day. So in some ways, it can be really helpful when you're struggling with a current stressor that you want to address, and you want real-time feedback, like, okay, this is what I did this morning. Was that a good idea? Or this is what I experienced this afternoon. What could I do differently? And for people who were home during the pandemic and unable to get out of the house anyway, I think that added support was really important. We're hearing from a lot of people who say being able to hear from a therapist a couple of times a day really helped me to stay on top of things, or to make sure I wasn't engaging in behaviors that aren't good for me. So there are lots of different ways to talk to therapists. There's some online therapy websites now offer psychiatry services. So you could see a psychiatrist if you wanted to learn whether antidepressants or anti-anxiety medication or some other medication might be an option for you. Other sites offer things like online support groups, so that if maybe you are battling depression, you might be able to meet with other people who are struggling with similar issues. Some of them have forums. Some of them have ways to just chat with other people who understand what you're going through. Some of them also offer educational services. So you might be able to tune into a webinar to learn about maybe an online shopping addiction, or to learn about how to manage stress. And they're taught by therapists, so you know that you're getting healthy information that is, I guess, sanctioned by the website. Uh-huh. And so there's lots of different ways to get treatment if you're interested in trying online therapy.
You're listening to Amy Morin, a psychotherapist and editor-in-chief of Verywell Mind. She hosts the Verywell Mind podcast and has written several books. The most recent is 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave.
After the break, what issues do people address in online therapy sessions?
Find out what online therapy is like.
Are there conditions that are most amenable to online treatment? Which ones are they?
Will insurance pay for teletherapy?
After such a long period of isolation, people may be feeling anxious about going out. Can therapy help people reintegrate into society?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is sponsored in part by Kaya Biotics. KAYA Biotics offers the first probiotics which are both certified organic and hypoallergenic.
All probiotics are produced in Germany under laboratory conditions with high-quality ingredients and under strict regulatory oversight.
The 3 available formulas are created for very specific purposes, such as strengthening the immune system, fighting yeast infections, and helping with weight loss.
To learn more about Kaya Biotics probiotics and the important topic of gut health, you can visit their website, KayaBiotics.com. That's KAYA Biotics.com. Use the discount code PEOPLE for $10 off your first purchase.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. Kaya Biotics.com.
Also by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoa flavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
Today we are discussing the pros and cons of online therapy. There are a lot of considerations that may make getting therapy over Zoom or through an app more or less helpful. What is online therapy like? How well could it work for problems like anxiety or depression? Do you ever wonder how a therapist keeps online clients straight?
Our guest is Amy Morin, licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind. She hosts the Very Well Mind podcast and has written several books. The most recent is 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave.
Amy, we are hearing from therapists, and we want to get your perspective, that they're just feeling overwhelmed. I mean, there's so many people who are desperate to get services, talk to somebody. They're feeling overwhelmed. The pandemic has been hard on everyone's mental health. So can you tell us, number one, what are some of the issues that people are struggling with over the past year? And number two, how therapists are dealing with the demand?
I'm hearing such a great need for people to get treatment for depression over the past year. I get lots of questions from people who say, I'm struggling and I really need some help here. And it's not surprising. Our main coping strategies, for the most part, were taken away from us. Somebody might say, normally I go out to dinner with my friends once a week, or I go to the gym, or I spend a lot of time with my family, my extended family. Most of us weren't able to do those things this year. So when you subtract our most important coping skills from our lives, we're then forced to figure out, what can I do? And our options were much more limited than usual. So people were saying, I'm trying yoga in my living room with an online yoga teacher, but this isn't normally what I would do. Or other people who said, I'm trying to read books, I'm trying to do art projects. It's not things I'm used to doing, but I can't see my friends in person. So this seems like the next best thing to try. And some people weren't getting outside. They weren't getting as much exercise. Other people weren't eating as healthy. They were reaching for comfort food. We know alcohol sales are on the rise. A lot of people said, I'm drinking way more than I ever have. And because of all of that, we're seeing so much depression and anxiety. And as you say, therapists are overwhelmed. And the last thing people want to hear when they're depressed and stressed out and anxious is that they're on a waiting list for maybe a month or 6 weeks to get in to see somebody. Because usually by the time somebody calls a therapist, they're ready to be seen right now. And the thought of waiting another 6 weeks to get in to see someone can just feel overwhelming. And so one of the great things that has happened is therapists are allowed to now cross state lines. It's a temporary issue that it's been an issue for a long time, that for the most part, if you're licensed, you can only see people within your state, even if you do online therapy. But there's been some relaxing of those rules because some states are just don't have enough therapists to treat everybody. And it hasn't solved all the problems, but it has helped immensely so that somebody can see a therapist online if their local therapists are just booked up for a really long time. And I know some therapists are working overtime trying to see everybody. I know other therapists and websites are offering a group counseling so that instead of just seeing one person who's depressed for an hour, maybe they can see 7 or 8 people who are battling depression, or maybe even bigger groups than that, 25 people. And a lot of places are offering reduced rates in terms of if you go to group therapy, maybe it's $20 to sit through an hour appointment for people that don't have insurance. And other websites have opened up just some support. Maybe it's not with a therapist per se, but there's places like a website called 7 Cups where you can speak to a trained listener. And it's somebody that will listen to you. They're not there to necessarily offer advice, but they can offer you some emotional support when you're going through things. And you can usually chat with somebody right away. You just go onto the website, you can put in a nickname, and usually within a couple of minutes, you can start talking to someone. But we know that even emergency rooms and hotlines have been overwhelmed with people calling because they are in crisis and they're really struggling to manage their mental health right now.
Amy, I'm wondering, how stressful is it for a therapist to say, I can't take on any new clients right now?
It feels awful. I've been there before, and I've had people that will call every single day to say, do you have any openings today? Did anybody cancel? Is there any way I can get in sooner? I'm really suffering here. And so we try to offer them alternative resources while they wait, which again might be support groups. It might be a different therapist. It might be an online resource or a website, because it's tough. And the tendency sometimes is to say, well, I'll work overtime. But as a therapist, you can only work so many hours before you get burned out. And if you start seeing too many people, you're going to struggle to be effective with the people that you do see. So you definitely have to set limits on how much time you spend as a therapist working, because you need to practice good self-care too.
Amy, can you tell us a little bit about what online therapy is like? I mean, if you had told therapists 20 years ago that someday there's going to be something called online therapy, first of all, they'd look at you like, what are you talking about? Online? What's that? But now it's a reality, and it's probably going to be with us going forward. A lot of people are not going to want to go back to the old-fashioned way. So give us a sense of what actually might happen in an online therapy session.
So again, it depends. For people who are already familiar with their patients, maybe they were seeing each other before the pandemic, then it might just be as simple as a Zoom call where they just chat by video. And one of the major differences is, for the most part, therapists usually try to be kind of a blank slate. We don't tell people about our lives because we don't want people to feel like that they can't tell us certain things if they know about whether we're single or we're married or we have a family or if we are a certain religion. So we usually try to not let out too much information because it might influence what people feel comfortable talking about or telling us. But when you do a Zoom call, you're kind of inviting people into your home. So people see the background of your house. Your child might interrupt a session, or they might see what your living room looks like. So that's definitely different. And for some therapists, that's really uncomfortable. In other cases where maybe somebody goes to an online therapist that they've never met and they have never really communicated with other than email, it's sort of like sending a message out into the universe without really knowing who it is replying. Sure, you see a picture of your therapist and you get a professional biography of them, so you know where they went to college and what kind of training or education they have, but you don't know a lot else. And again, you might use a nickname, and so your therapist doesn't necessarily even know what your name is. And for some people, that's helpful because you feel anonymous. You feel like you can share those facts, or you can share some secrets that maybe you never told anybody else. But I think other people feel like they're more of an anonymous person out there. They're faceless, they're nameless, and they feel like their therapist might get them mixed up. If the therapist is answering dozens of emails a day, how do they keep everybody straight when they don't have a name to or a face to attach to whatever name you use? But again, for some people, that's helpful to be able to just send emails back and forth and to feel like they're getting support in real time.
So how does the therapist keep everybody straight?
Well, they don't always. We found this when we tested all the online therapy sites. Sometimes there was 5 of us who tested all of the sites. For a lot of us, the therapists got us mixed up with other people, or they'd say, remember when we talked about X, Y, or Z, or don't you live in such and such a place? And it wasn't true because they were getting us mixed up with some of their other clients. So that's definitely an issue when you're communicating via online messaging only.
Amy, what about cost? There was a time when insurance companies were reluctant to pay for therapy beyond, a crisis management. They were very happy to pay for antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents, a variety of medications, because they perceived that as more cost-effective. But there are a lot of people who say, I want to talk to someone. I need therapy. I don't need a pill. Are insurance companies paying for online therapy? And what if the insurance company doesn't? How much will it cost?
That's a good question. So our therapy health insurance system for behavioral health, mental health is definitely broken. For a long time, they've only paid if you have a mental health diagnosis, which means you have to wait until you're sick to get your treatment paid for. So, we don't pay for checkups like we would seeing your primary care physician, or there's no way to just talk to somebody when you're stressed as opposed to waiting until you have full-blown depression. Online therapy is definitely helping with that. One of the ways it's helping is it costs a lot less to see an online therapist. So for people who pay out of pocket, it might be a subscription service where you will pay a couple of $100s a month, but you get unlimited access to a therapist for a couple $100s. Often that's less than people would pay when they see a therapist in person and they have copays. Even if they just have a $20 copay or $40 copay, that adds up every month, sometimes to less than what it would cost to subscribe to an online therapy site. For a long time, insurance companies didn't cover online therapy, but that's changing. Part of it has been the pandemic has changed a lot of that they're realizing that online therapy can be just as effective. And in some studies, it shows it's more effective than face-to-face treatment. And so they're starting to pay, and online therapy websites are starting to accept more insurances. Some places offer financial assistance. BetterHelp, for instance, if somebody enters their financial information and says, I can't pay, they will help you with that. And it's usually pretty easy to cancel your subscription service too. So usually a click of a button and you can end it at pretty much any time. So if you decide it's not helpful, it's not what you signed up for, it's not working, then you can see services pretty quickly. And a lot of them offer different tiers of service. So if you just want to message a therapist, it's a certain price. If you want to do online video sessions, you might pay a little bit more. But you can usually find a plan that works for you, regardless of whether your insurance covers it or not. There are a lot of options these days.
Amy, what sorts of conditions are amenable to online therapy? We talked about the fact that a lot of people are feeling depressed or anxious. Perhaps they're getting into alcohol overuse. What things are actually amenable to online therapy?
Almost anything that can be treated in an office can be treated online. So a lot of therapists will treat things like PTSD and help people address past trauma. They can also address depression, anxiety, and even addiction. Substance abuse issues are quite common for online therapists to treat. And some websites specifically offer couples counseling online, which is interesting as well. Some sites offer treatment for teenagers. Most of them don't treat children. So say a 7-year-old, parents would probably really struggle to find online therapy for a younger child. But for the most part, there are different types of treatment modalities offered in lots of different places. Or if somebody wants to, say, do Christian counseling, there are Christian counseling websites. Or if somebody identifies as being gay, for instance, there are therapy websites that specifically reach out to those communities. So for people who say, I have a specific issue, one of the great things is that if you reach out to an online therapist, you have a bigger pool of therapists to choose from. So you might be able to find somebody who specializes in your particular issue. If you take somebody who lives in a rural community where there's only 3 or 4 therapists available, you're going to struggle to find somebody who specializes in, say, OCD treatment. But when you get to reach out to an online therapist, opens the door to all sorts of different people. So you might be able to see somebody who specializes in something specific that you wouldn't be able to see them in person.
Amy, I'm wondering about people who have, I don't even really know what the best term for it is these days, social anxiety disorder, agoraphobia. But, everybody's been, or at least most people have been sort of locked in at home. They've been told, don't go out to a restaurant. Don't hang out with your friends. And so they've kind of been hunkering down for over a year. And now a lot of people are going, well, I'm feeling a little anxious about just going to the grocery store. I'm feeling anxious about getting together with friends. So for people who have a social anxiety disorder, it seems like this is going to magnify that. How will therapy help them reintegrate into society?
Yeah, for people with social anxiety, this year has been sort of welcomed because it was normal to not go out in public. But we know that with any type of anxiety, the less you do something that's anxiety provoking, the harder it is to do it. So for people who have avoided talking to people face to face, they've avoided public situations for more than a year, it's going to be tough to get back out there. And even people who don't necessarily have social anxiety or didn't before the pandemic, a lot of people are feeling really anxious about getting back out there because we haven't done it in so long. So therapists will give people homework, especially when it comes to something like social anxiety.
What kind of homework?
It might be about practicing going out and talking to one person. Maybe you ask a stranger a question. At other times, it might be even making a phone call, calling a restaurant and saying, "How late are you open?" Just to get practice asking somebody a question. It also might involve changing the way you think. Somebody with social anxiety might be thinking, "This is awful, it's horrible, I'm going to embarrass myself." So a therapist will give them a way to reframe those thoughts so that they aren't thinking that. And a therapist might also prescribe some exercises to manage all of the anxious feelings that come up. So when somebody's heart is racing and they feel their blood pressure going up, maybe some breathing exercises helps them calm down enough so they can step outside and go to the store, or that they feel like they can make a phone call and get through it. And so there may be specific things they do every day, like make 3 phone calls a day and ask somebody a question. Or maybe it's talk to one stranger every single day. And then in the therapy sessions, they talk about how that went, whether they did it, if there were any problems, and then they come up with a plan for the following week.
Amy, what about reconnecting with family and friends before, all of the restrictions are lifted? How can people do that online?
So some people might find that starting with a Zoom call, video chat, or even just a phone call or reaching out to somebody is helpful before we see each other in person. What I'm hearing from a lot of people is they're saying, well, I'm uncomfortable talking to people these days because the truth is I don't have anything to talk about. Normally, I would talk about what went on in the office, or I would talk about my kids' sporting events or a concert I went to. I haven't done anything in the past year. What am I going to talk about? I don't want to call people and just talk about the pandemic or what it's been like to sit on my couch for the last year. So I'm hearing from so many people who are just anxious about seeing people again and then thinking, what do we talk about when we get together? So it's helpful sometimes to just come up with a plan. What are 3 things you can talk about? 3 interesting questions you might ask someone. And you might start the conversation online, whether it's through a video chat or you just reach out to them on social media or you set up a phone call to talk to somebody so that you can get used to it. Social skills are like any other skills. We need to practice them to keep them sharp. And most people are out of practice right now. But if we just jump back into it and we start practicing them again, it'll get easier.
You're listening to Amy Morin, licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind. She hosts the Very Well Mind podcast and has written several books. Her most recent book is 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave. Are you starting to see your friends in person again? Do you feel anxious about it? How do you think you can help others who may be experiencing some anxiety?
After the break, we'll talk about children's mental health struggles during the pandemic.
How can we help kids deal with stress?
Are there good ways to model resilience?
When is online therapy not appropriate?
Can we use online therapy to break down some of the stigma that still clings to mental health problems? What online therapy groups and apps appear most helpful?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you by Verazana Health Club. This comprehensive home testing service enables you to track crucial health markers of gut health, inflammation, metabolism, hormones, thyroid function, and many other organ systems. Regular testing can help detect health imbalances before they lead to illness. Online at Verazana.com. That's Verizana.com/health-club. Get 50% off the first month with the discount code PEOPLE50. That's PEOPLE 50.
The People's Pharmacy podcast is supported in part by CocoVia Memory Plus. CocoVia cocoflavanols support both cardiovascular health and cognitive function by promoting healthy blood flow, transporting oxygen and nutrients to vital organs and muscles, including your heart and brain.
CocoVia Memory Plus has 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that have been proven to help boost memory.
CocoVia Memory Plus is backed by 4 clinical trials that demonstrate improvement in 3 different aspects of memory: long-term memory, spatial memory, and word recall. The studies show improved brain function in just 8 weeks.
You can try the benefits of CocoVia Memory Plus with a 25% discount off your first month. Use the code PEOPLES25. To get the full benefits, take it daily for 8 weeks. CocoVia is offering People's Pharmacy podcast listeners a 10% discount on subscriptions. That code is PEOPLES10. Learn more at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a supplement with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols, the plant-based nutrients from fresh cocoa that help support memory. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. Kaya Biotics.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
We're talking today about the strengths and the shortcomings of doing therapy online. During the pandemic, it was the only option a lot of people had for psychological counseling. As things open up, will people stick with this new option? We're also talking about how parents and other adults can help support children under stress. We should be able to show them how to ask for help when they need it, as well as how to practice self-care.
Our guest today is Amy Morin, a psychotherapist and editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind. She hosts the Very Well Mind podcast and has written several books. The most recent is 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave. Amy, I suspect that children have had at least as many struggles with mental health issues over the course of the last year as adults, maybe more. I love the title of your book, 13 Things Strong Kids Do, one of them being Act Brave, Think Big. Can you tell us a little bit about the kinds of challenges kids have faced and what you would recommend, and any stories that you might have to illustrate, how kids can think big and act brave?
So I'm hearing from so many kids who are struggling, and they've lost some of the activities they like to do, like playing sports or their after-school activities. And we're asking so many kids to sit through school via Zoom, which for a lot of kids is really uncomfortable. It's a hard way to learn. And even as adults who are sitting through Zoom meetings all day, we're figuring out that that's tough to do. It does something to our brains. It's not a good substitute for face-to-face communication. And when they've done studies on how people are coping with the pandemic, we're finding that young people between the ages of 11 and 17 are the most likely to be depressed right now. Yet we often talk about the struggles in terms of what adults are facing, that adults are struggling with financial issues, or that adults are struggling with not being able to see their parents and those sorts of things. And we often forget that what it's like for kids right now. And I'm hearing from some kids who feel like they just aren't being heard when they tell their parents, it's really hard to go to online school. It's tough to learn math when I'm sitting in my bedroom. And their parents say things like, well, I would have loved to have not had to go to school when I was a kid. And then kids feel like, oh, like you just don't understand, or that my feelings are wrong, or that this isn't helpful. And it causes them to think that that nobody understands what they're going through.
Which, if I'm correct, has been a chorus of kids ever since I can remember, and I'm pretty old.
Yeah, and granted, we don't know what it's like to be 12 years old and to not be able to go to school and to have to do online Zoom school or something like that, or to lose our after school activities. But minimizing how kids feel isn't helpful. We need them to know that if they're missing soccer practice or they're missing being able to hang out with their friends on the weekends, that's a legitimate concern, and that it's okay to be sad about that, and to teach them how to cope with those feelings rather than tell them they shouldn't feel that way. So I'm working with a lot of families these days who are interested in knowing, how do we find healthy coping skills when we can't leave the house? And sometimes simple things help. It might be as simple as saying, let's plan a movie to watch on Friday night. Maybe your family usually watches a movie together on Friday night every week, but you don't put it in the schedule. Something as simple as picking out the movie on Monday that you're going to watch on Friday, putting it in the schedule, saying, okay, at 7:00, the whole family's going to get together and watch this movie. It gives kids something to look forward to. Maybe they even plan what you're going to eat for a snack while you're watching it. And having something to look forward to is so important for their mental health right now. And then when you do that fun thing together, they get another big boost in their mental health. And then you've created a positive memory together, so they get a third boost in their mental health. But just knowing, how do we support kids right now? How do we teach them healthy coping skills? And how do we use this as an opportunity so that they can learn? And I think that a lot of kids can come out of this stronger and wiser and better because of it, as long as we're giving them the skills and tools that they need to practice coping with the stress they're experiencing.
Amy, do you have any examples, something you could share?
Yeah. So I know this family who both parents were working from home this year, and both kids were at home doing online school. Mom felt really guilty because she said, I'm trying to educate my kids, yet at the same time, I need them to be quiet during the day. And because I'm working too, and the whole family was sort of in this rough spot. And so they decided that it was okay to send the kids to daycare. It was a daycare that was doing some practices to make sure that everything was safe and that families were doing all they could to social distance and those sorts of things. And they found that the kids flourished once they went somewhere else, because they were able to get out of the house. They were able to do something that they felt was good for them. And mom and dad didn't feel guilty anymore. They felt like they were free in the evenings to say, okay, let's do fun things together. Whereas before, when the kids were home, they felt like they still had to work all the time because they didn't get enough done during the day. And mom and dad both felt a lot of guilt for a while about, we're letting the kids watch too much TV, or we're giving them screens. Whereas last year we were saying, only spend a few minutes playing video games. And this year we're saying, just sit there and play video games. So I think it's important for parents to know that the rules have changed, that life is a little bit different, and it's okay to do things differently. And that we don't necessarily need to shield our kids from difficult circumstances. We just need to give them the skills and tools they need to grow and flourish, and to let them know that, okay, things are different, but we're going to try this as an experiment. They didn't know if the whole daycare thing was going to be helpful or not, but they tried it and found out that it was. But had it not been, they would have said, okay, that didn't work. Let's try something else. This is a great year to practice experiments and to problem solve together, and to say, let's try this. So that kids know when they're struggling with something, you go ahead and try something. If it doesn't work out, you try something else.
And I suppose that's really a good way to model adaptability and resilience, if the parents can find that resilience within themselves.
Absolutely. That's the biggest way that kids learn, is by watching us. And if we minimize everything, if we say, oh, this year's not a problem, and we act as though it's not, kids still know when we're stressed out. The kids know things are really different. So it's okay to talk to kids about how you're feeling. And of course, you don't want to burden them with extra stress or tell them all about your adult problems. But on the other hand, it's okay to say, I'm really sad that we haven't been able to see grandma this year. This is hard. What can we do about it? And I had another family who decided that they would schedule a Zoom call with grandma once a week. And then the kids would also wrote her a letter once a week. And it was just a way for them to stay connected, even though they made it clear this isn't a substitute for the time we always spend together, but let's do the best we have with the situation that we're in.
Oh, that sounds like a really good idea. Amy, you mentioned that online therapy is available maybe for teenagers, but usually not so available for the younger children. Are there situations in which online therapy really isn't all that appropriate or helpful? What would they be?
I'm glad that you asked that because it isn't a good option for everyone. If somebody, say, is actively hallucinating, online therapy is not the right level of care. Or if somebody is seriously suicidal, it might not be a good idea to see an online therapist. Somebody might need emergency treatment. Or if somebody is in such a state of addiction that they're not really able to communicate with somebody in a healthy way, online therapy is not a good service for them either. So when somebody has more serious mental health issues, they may need a different level of care than online therapy. Online therapy requires a certain level of insight. You have to participate. You have to be willing to show up. You have to be a little bit more self-motivated. And when people are in a state where they aren't able to be organized enough to remember their meetings, or they aren't in a place where they can actively participate, online therapy might not be a good choice.
Amy, there are a lot of people, I think especially some older folks, who they feel a little uncomfortable with the concept of mental health. You know, the idea is that asking for help is sort of a sign of weakness. And I often think that guys in particular have a little trouble or struggle asking for assistance. How can online therapy break down some of those barriers and stigmas?
Oh, that's a great question as well. So a lot of people do think that. They think if you go to therapy, it means you're broken. If you go see somebody, then it means there's something seriously wrong with you. But we don't do that with other things. If you see a dentist for your teeth, we don't say it's because there's something wrong with you. So for people to know that seeing a therapist just means that you're strong enough to take care of yourself, you are interested in managing your mind the best that you can, those things are important. And online therapy for a lot of people makes it a little bit easier because there's not as much of the stigma attached. If you live in a rural area, you might be concerned about seeing a therapist because you don't know who you'll see in the waiting room. I used to work in a rural area where sometimes teachers would see their students in the waiting room, and then they would say, well, how's this going to change things for me if my 10th grade student knows that I'm in treatment as well? And those are legitimate concerns. Or the principal of a school who was concerned with what if their employees found out, would that change things? So online therapy, because you can be more anonymous, sometimes that makes it easier for people to reach out and they feel as though they can be more open. And again, in rural areas, sometimes the only therapist in town might be your cousin's best friend, somebody that you know on the outside. So being able to see a therapist online opens the door to more options, and you feel like maybe you can be a little more anonymous than you would be, and nobody necessarily has to know. If you're seeing an online therapist, you might be able to keep it fairly private. I know some people don't even tell their partners necessarily that they're seeing someone, but because they're only sending text messages or they're only using email, it's easier to do that versus if they were to drive to a therapist's office, they have to explain where they were for the last hour and a half. But you don't necessarily have to do that if you're talking to somebody online.
Now, there are a lot of different types of therapy. We've talked about we've talked about cognitive behavioral therapy. I know there's something called dialectic behavioral therapy, psychodynamic therapy. I don't think I should go on and on naming all the different types of therapy, but are there some that work especially well online and some that are a little more awkward?
That's an interesting point, because cognitive behavioral therapy does work well online, which is about helping people identify unhelpful thoughts, about addressing their emotions and changing their behavior. Usually involves homework, really specific things somebody might do in practice. A dialectical behavior therapy is often done in a group, and it's a little more difficult to do online. While you can still have group meetings, it's a little different. The dynamics are different. When people sit in the same room together, they can talk about, I tried this week, or I tried this experiment and it didn't work out so well. They get the support of the other group members. Online, it's a little more anonymous, and so group therapy can be tougher because somebody might not be as open when they don't know who's in the group. Otherwise, sometimes we don't have that. Other people aren't as likely to call us out in a gentle way of saying, gosh, I don't know that was a good idea. And then other types of therapy too, say a couples therapy. It's interesting doing that online. It works well for couples who maybe aren't in the same place. If you have a couple where maybe somebody works in a different state and they only see each other on the weekends, they can still do couples therapy online during the weekday. They don't necessarily have to be in the same room at the same time to chat with a therapist. Couples therapy sometimes works with couples leaving messages in a room with a therapist. So if the one partner can type the message in the morning, another partner might do it in the afternoon, the therapist might chime in the evening, and it works that way. So it does open the door to different options for couples who maybe aren't in a traditional relationship where they live in the same place and they can go see a therapist at the same time.
Amy, we are just about out of time. I would hope you could help our listeners get a better sense of online therapy and maybe mention some of the best online therapy groups that you've reviewed so that people will even just have a glimmer of how to get started.
So one of the best places, I think, is Talkspace, just because they offer a lot more services, a lot more opportunities in terms of who you talk to, how you talk to them, and have a solid background in terms of how they pick their therapists, and they're all licensed. BetterHelp is another one that's the one that gives some financial support if you need it. And they allow for phone calls. So if you don't have a strong internet connection, that can be a great alternative. One of the best free resources is 7cups.com, where you can talk to somebody, a trained listener, a volunteer. They're not a therapist, but they're somebody who is trained to listen. And you can usually get connected with somebody within just a couple of minutes. And you can tell them whatever you want, and you can remain completely anonymous.
Amy, could you tell us how 7 Cups is spelled? Is that with the number 7 or the word 7?
The number 7 and then CUPS.
Great. Thank you. Because I know that there are people who just want somebody to be able to listen.
And there's a lot of value in that, in telling somebody something who is objective. So you don't have to tell your friends and family necessarily, but sometimes it's easier to talk to a stranger.
And summing up the value of online therapy?
It's hugely valuable. Just being able to talk to an objective person, and it can help you make a lot of sense of what's going on in your head and can help you feel a lot better.
Amy Morin, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Amy Morin, a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist, and editor-in-chief of Very Well Mind. She hosts the Very Well Mind podcast and has written several books. The most recent is 13 Things Strong Kids Do. Think big, feel good, act brave. It was published this spring.
I really like the idea of using online therapy to overcome the stigma of needing help for mental health. If getting therapy online can do that, it would be great.
I appreciate Amy Morin sharing with us some of the apps that seem to be especially helpful, such as Talkspace, BetterHelp, or 7cups.com. That's the number 7.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
The People's Pharmacy is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with The People's Pharmacy.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia Memory Plus, a cocoflavanol supplement backed by 4 clinical studies that show significant improvement in 3 different aspects of memory. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products made in Germany. KAYA Biotics.com.
Also by Verazana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome. Now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com.
Today's show is number 1260. You can find the podcast at our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you go to peoplespharmacy.com, you can share your thoughts about today's show in the comment section of show number 1260. If you've tried online therapy, tell us how the experience worked for you. Would you recommend it for a friend?
How have you coped with the pandemic? Has the isolation been difficult? Now that people are gathering indoors as well as outside, how are you adapting to the new conditions?
You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning. You might want to share it with a friend or family member.
At our website, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you'll also have regular access to our weekly podcast and find out ahead of time which topics we'll be covering.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week.